I'm Maxine Fisher, 33, standing in the glass-walled lobby of a downtown office, the kind with marble floors that echo every heel strike. Dad asks, "Do you work here?" loud enough for the receptionist to look up. Nate Fisher, my brother, smirks behind him. "No," I say, meeting the eyes of Jenna Collins, my operations chief, and Marcus Reed, my general counsel. "I'm the owner." A camera on a tripod blinks red. Riley Stone, my PR lead, nods to start the live stream countdown. "This is the Rescue Summit. They think it's a lifeline. It's a ledger. I'm here to close accounts in public, and the room will watch the line items I write. Before I tell you how I took everything they said I wasn't and used it to take back everything they said I couldn't, tell me where you're listening from." I read every comment. Subscribe, hit the bell, and don't miss more family revenge stories. Stick around, I'll need witnesses. My days before the break were a long list of small emergencies dressed up as routine. I ran store-level profit and loss statements before sunrise, toggling between 14 tabs for 14 locations while 3 were flagged for labor drift. My phone woke me at 5:30. I answered vendor calls at 7, negotiated delivery windows, and argued crate counts over the hiss of a bad connection. By 8:30, I was at a back office table with a general manager from a unit that had been bleeding eggs and labor for 2 weeks. We walked prep lists, set portion sizes, and I timed a line cook's ticket to check the 9-minute goal for lunch rush. I measured everything I could touch: table turn times, ticket times, average check, waste percentage. The brand smelled like oil and lemon cleaner, grills humming, fryer timers chirping, laminated menus smudged with ketchup prints from impatient kids. On paper, my title read Operations Manager. In practice, I was the person who plugged every leak. I built schedules that held labor to budget, trained managers in service recovery so comps stayed under control, and rewrote vendor terms to stop surprise invoices. I set a standard: every table turned in 40 minutes, 9-minute ticket times on lunch, 0 comps without manager sign-off. If a dishwasher broke at 5 p.m., I found a rental, called the vendor rep, and stayed until the last seat was cleared. Dad liked to drop in unannounced and bark about window decals while I rewired the back office to make payroll reconcile. Nate drifted store to store like a visiting dignitary, autographs and selfies. He promised renovations and big ideas, but when the invoices came due, I was usually the one negotiating a payment plan. Execution was how money moved, and so I stayed down in the machine and kept it running. Dad taught me one lesson in every audible way: authority is a birthright, not a deliverable. He believed respect was something you demanded by standing at the head of the room and expecting people to remember your story. Mom perfected a different skill. She could smile at anyone and make the room forget whatever argument was wrapping itself around the table. She handled donors, charity luncheons, community boards, and the social face of our name, all with a practiced tilt of the head and the right casserole. I was the daughter who understood the business but who, in the family lexicon, wasn't leadership material. That phrase was a contradiction the family wore like corporate policy. Nate became the story Dad told the town. A natural leader, a visionary, someone who could charm a banker into closing his eyes. I was the woman who scheduled shifts, fixed cost leaks, and showed up at 5 a.m. with sleeve-rolled resolve. At meetings, my projections were called theoretical, while Nate's guesses were bold. The company had a history: 30 years, 14 locations, a signature sauce, an origin myth centered on Dad, and a handshake. I kept my head down because execution pays the bills. I learned to let the public story be whatever it wanted. Behind the curtains were spreadsheets, vendor commitments, and staff names I wouldn't forget. Those were the real measures of worth in my world. The anniversary banquet was a study in good lighting and bad timing. The hotel ballroom had chandeliers, folded tent cards on round tables, and a stage with a single microphone under 2 bright spotlights. My name was on the printed program to present the growth plan: digital kitchens, vendor consolidation, a franchise support desk, and cross-training that would stop labor bleed. Bankers came with their portfolio managers in clean suits. Franchisees compared notes at table centers. Press badges flashed at the door like camera teeth. I'd scrubbed my slide deck until it looked like stands and dollars, not theories. The agenda put leadership last, exactly where applause lives and last impressions stick. Dad paced in a side room, rehearsing the lines he wanted to keep in the paper's story. Nate practiced his smile near the champagne. Mom smoothed her dress and touched a necklace the way some people touch rosaries. I tightened my notes into a binder because I wanted to be precise in a room that rewards theater. The MC had a program and a name badge. The stage had a mic and an expectation. I had a plan that could save margins, protect franchises, and cut vendor costs. But the test in that room wasn't about solutions. It was about who got credit, who got named, and who could be erased with a sentence. The tension in me was the exact kind you feel when your work is being measured not for impact but for authorship. 10 minutes before I walked to the microphone, Dad moved my laptop off the podium and replaced it with his note cards. He did it with a slow confidence, like a man shifting a chess piece in front of an audience. The MC announced me, then Dad stepped forward instead, taking the mic with practiced ease. I watched Mom touch her necklace. It was a small signal, nervous, rehearsed. A camera operator adjusted focus toward Dad's broad shoulders and the grin on Nate's face, not on me. Nate lingered offstage with a champagne flute he hadn't paid for, speaking quietly with a franchisee about new directions. The room smelled like buttered rolls and anticipation. I inhaled a steady breath to speak. Dad leaned into the microphone and said, "We're changing things." The phrasing sounded like a town crier announcing a shift in weather, but it carried a threat. The ballroom quieted the way rooms do when people wait for a scandal to unfold. I felt the little tremor that tells you a test isn't about answers anymore, but about your place in the story. I knew something was about to break. I just didn't know they'd chosen to break me. My deck sat closed on the podium like a book someone else had put down. The MC shuffled papers and looked everywhere but at me. Cameras pivoted, flashbulbs blinked, and the room did what rooms do when an authority speaks. It reorganized around the voice. People looked for cues, where to clap, who to breathe with, who to pretend they'd always favored. A franchisee at table 6 glanced at me and then away. I noticed the small things, the way the chandelier threw a streak across Dad's forehead, the way Nate's shoulders relaxed into applause he hadn't earned. A waitress passed with a tray, avoiding the stage like we were a crime scene. It wasn't the sentence alone, it was the ritual of the naming. They had erased the work in front of an audience so they could invent a story about birthright. Dad announced Nate as CEO like he was presenting a plaque. The applause came on cue, some hands slow, some hands mechanical. The photographer who'd spent a week following the founder's image angled for the celebratory shot, father and son, fatherly hand on son's back. My name stayed on the printed program like a typo left uncorrected. It felt like an inheritance being auctioned while I watched the gavel fall and the room pretend it was always meant to be that way. I felt heat run from my palms up my arms. My chest was hollow in the center, not hurt so much as emptied. All those nights on the road, the early mornings, the calls about missing deliveries, the spreadsheets that saved margins gone in a line. The sound of forks and soft conversations resumed, as if someone had turned the world back on. Mom touched my elbow and pressed her hand there the way she does when she wants to stop a storm without asking for the wind to change. She whispered, "Don't make this worse," and the words were a blanket and a cage. My inbox filled with the polite mercies of people who wanted distance more than truth. "So sorry," all of them said, which reads like condolence if you own nothing to lose. A bank analyst I'd worked with for years avoided me, eyes skimming past my face to the stage where the cameras still glowed. The photographer re-aimed his lens to capture the family portrait Dad wanted. Corinne Doyle, our chief financial officer, hovered at the side and mouthed, "I'm sorry," without meeting me. Her apology had no teeth. I could tell she was boxed by numbers, not loyalty. A junior manager who used to email me weekly numbers without prompting asked if he should keep sending them. Dad answered before I could, "No." It was the most bureaucratic form of erasure, blocking the data that proves you existed. The plan I'd built, months of conversations, vendor renegotiations, pilot models, was buried on the ballroom floor between place settings and dessert forks. My slides were still on my hard drive, but in human terms they were table scraps. A franchisee across the room shifted in his chair and looked at his peers the way people do when they have to choose which side of a ledger keeps them solvent. The message that night was bone deep and simple. Accept useful invisibility, stop making claims, or go away. I left without dessert. I walked out into the cool night air and let the heat from the ballroom roll off my shoulders in the way you shrug off an ill-fitting coat. Humiliation is a funny thing. It can calcify if you do nothing, but it can also be fuel. I didn't argue or storm the podium. I didn't raise my voice or send a dramatic email. I went home and packed what I needed. A laptop, binders I was legally allowed to copy, vendor files, and a small cardboard box of receipts. I opened a fresh notebook, the cheap kind with a black cover and a line down the spine, and wrote on the first page "acquisition vehicle" in block letters so it wouldn't be ignored. At 2:07 a.m., after hours of staring at that page and mapping what I had versus what I needed, I sent a resignation that said strategic misalignment and nothing more. I turned off the company email and closed the door on a role where my value was measured by someone else's script. I chose not to fight the past on its stage. I decided to design a future where I own the stage. The urgency was simple. I needed capital, a legal structure that would let me buy influence, a team that could execute, and a plan to make the chain dependent on my decisions instead of the other way around. I didn't know then exactly what buy influence would look like, but I knew the levers: debt, leases, franchisee consent were the hardware of this business. I needed to build a machine that could pull those levers with precision. I also needed allies, people who could sign templates without hiccups, who could stand in public when I asked them to, and who understood that rescue work is cold because stakes are hot. That night I wrote lists. Capital sources, names of couchsurfing investors, banks with workout desks, landlord reps who answered calls after hours. I mapped the data I'd need, the legal paperwork to pre-draft, and the small kindnesses that earn loyalty: on-time payrolls, fair vendor terms, and an operational playbook that didn't ask people to pretend they were fine. Humiliation had lit something in me, but the plan had to be pragmatic, not petulant. I formed a holding company with a clean, neutral name. Marcus Reed, the lawyer I trusted for his precision, drafted the operating agreement in language that wouldn't scare investors but would protect decision rights. We registered a turnaround firm with a simple service list on the filings: operational audits, debt workouts, interim management, lease step-ins. I wanted the world to know we were repair people, not opportunists. Jenna Collins, who'd been a regional manager in our franchise network and knew the receipts and the bruises, signed on the day I offered her a chair. She brought practical stubbornness and a list of managers who would follow her into fire if the plan made sense. We built templates like a surgeon builds scalpel sets: a forbearance agreement that spelled out cure paths, a management change clause that clicked into place when certain numbers stopped moving, a vendor triage checklist for immediate cost fixes, and a summit agenda that would let us show up with proof. I mapped bank debt across a spreadsheet with neat columns: who owned what loan, payment history, and where the covenant triggers lived. We set rules for ourselves: no bluffing, no rescue without control rights, no publicity until we owned the narrative. Investors sniffed for majority control. I said no and kept us lean. The first friction was money. People wanted equity and a board seat. I decided I'd rather move slow with control than fast without it. We registered contracts, opened a modest office space with a table and a whiteboard, and practiced the list of truths I'd need to say out loud. The machine was cold and efficient at first: paperwork, calls, data rooms. It felt like building a house during a storm, hauling bricks so the wind couldn't take what we were making. I kept one hand on the ledger and the other on a human list of people who deserved steady pay. I was no longer the daughter who understood the business for the family's story. I was the operator who would use every tool the business offered to make survival and dignity align. Next, I traced leases like veins. Noah Grant, the landlord representative, became a crucial mapmaker. He read leases the way some people read poetry, attentive to clauses most people ignore. He pointed out step-in language we could use if operations endangered the premises, clauses about safety, maintenance, and managerial competence that had been ignored for years. Those clauses were small doors in a wall that would otherwise be impenetrable. We identified 3 flagships with the most obvious step-in potential places where foot traffic mattered most and where a landlord would prefer a working restaurant to empty rent checks. Franchisees were a different exercise. They were wary and practical. I met Tom Barker after hours at his store, hands still smelling of fryer oil. Tom wasn't interested in family drama. He was interested in payroll, food cost, and whether his ovens would stay hot. I listened more than I talked and presented cash flow models that translated relief into weeks of solvency. He signed a conditional consent. He'd back a management change if we guaranteed food cost relief in 30 days and stability in supply. That gave me something tangible to offer other owners. If you sign, we can give you a plan that lowers your cost of goods and trains staff quickly. 10 franchisors signed a similar letter after we modeled the food cost relief on calls and showed them vendor consolidation numbers. We started to see a pattern: buy the debt cheap, pre-negotiate landlord step-ins, and secure enough franchisee consents to control the vote for a management change. It wasn't glamorous, it was arithmetic and persistence. I set rules: no press until we controlled the narrative, no rescue that didn't include control rights, and no deals that traded long-term governance for quick capital. The levers were there: debt, leases, franchisee votes. Pull them in the right order and the machine would lock where we wanted it. Setbacks arrived like weather fronts, predictable in thought, disruptive in practice. A private equity fund sniffed around and floated a term sheet that would have given them majority control in exchange for capital. They were polished and fast, but their only interest was ownership, not stabilization. I refused. The fund would have pushed me out and sold the brand into pieces. Saying no cost me 6 months of runway because I walked away from quick cash. That delay forced other choices. Noah hit a brick wall with one landlord who refused the step-in language. He demanded a cure timeline with penalty caps before he'd agree to any control terms, negotiating that cost time and concessions. 2 franchisees called me disloyal for what they called going against family. Their anger stung at first, but I learned to answer in numbers. Here's how much you save, here's how many employees keep their jobs, not in feelings. Claire's credit committee pushed back too. They wanted a higher price for the debt than I'd budgeted. We countered with covenant breach math, inspection reports, and a mapping of short-term future losses to hold the line on price. Money tightened. I burned through my savings in legal fees and travel. I reduced my own expenses: no salary for 6 months, no dinners out, no safety net. I found myself negotiating hotel rates with an intensity that used to surprise people who thought a founder's life was glamour. The forced change in approach was clear. If equity would cost me control, I'd switch to a debt-led model, buy the paper at 42 cents on the dollar and own the trigger. It wasn't nobility, it was survival. I recalibrated everything to that math and adjusted the plan to make a smaller pile of capital go farther. Under Nate, the chain started to bleed in ways that were obvious and in ways that were only visible in spreadsheets. He launched renovation projects that smelled of trends: barnwood paneling, Edison bulbs, chalkboard paint, without a single return on investment model. He'd sign contracts for glossy marketing that pushed the image but left the ovens untouched. Supplier arrangements shifted into the murky place where convenience meets kickback. I obtained copies of emails from a vendor rep offering marketing support in exchange for increased volume. The language was thinly veiled. Those deals meant product choices were being driven by hidden dollars, not by quality control. Labor costs crept up because overtime approvals went unsigned and managers ignored scheduling protocols. Turnover spiked because training was treated like an optional video, not a program with checklists. Guest complaints beginning to double were not just numbers, they were voices saying the experience had deteriorated, that portion sizes were inconsistent, that chicken arrived undercooked. Ticket times stretched beyond our 9-minute lunch goal. Comps rose as managers made quick decisions to avoid complaints without understanding the cost. The bank noticed. Claire sent the first quiet nudge. A covenant notice flagged that if trends continued for 2 quarters, the bank would have to move formally. It was the kind of administrative sentence that carries real consequences. Dad dismissed it as cyclical, the same line he used when numbers didn't suit him. He hosted ribbon cuttings for the renovated places and smiled for the camera, convinced that a new look would rearrange the finances. He couldn't see that the structural problems, supply disruptions, hidden vendor incentives, and a hollowed-out training depth weren't solved by an aesthetic facelift. Nate wanted the applause of his own unveiling while the engine behind the scenes misfired. I watched the slow decline as if watching a slow leak in a hull. You can patch a drip with tape, but not the crack opening below. Collateral damage started to show up in the margins of spreadsheets as human lines. Layoffs came in small packages. Assistant managers who'd been with us for years received notices that their benefits would be cut. One assistant manager lost health insurance while she was mid-pregnancy. I wrote her name down and kept it in a folder that I touched before meetings, a reminder that these were not numbers. Some of the smallest decisions had the largest human ripple. Mom called once, her voice bright and brittle, asking if I'd come home for a Sunday dinner. I said I was busy building something and held the phone a little too long, listening to the silence that followed. Corinne Doyle, the chief financial officer, started sending anonymized ratios from a personal email address. The data she shared carried a cautious tone because she was still boxed by obligations and fear. Her messages were a quiet confession more than a defection. Ben Carter, a local business reporter, reached out for comment on the slowing performance. He wanted a quote that would fit a column. I gave him facts and timelines, and he filed questions that would keep a public thread breathing. Vendors tightened terms abruptly, they shortened credit lines and rerouted deliveries. Fresh produce arrived incomplete, forcing substitutions that customers could taste. Quality suffered on plates and people noticed. The brand's reputation, built over decades by careful recipes and long nights, started to fray in ways I could point to and measure. Sympathy couldn't reorder a truck or pay a vendor's prepayment, so at some point I had to convert outrage into strategy. Feelings wouldn't keep lights on, contracts and timely payrolls would. I began to treat those human costs as urgent operational priorities, triage to be addressed with money and management, not guilt. Jenna translated operational theory into a 30 to 60 to 90 plan so practical it could be laminated and handed to a cook mid-shift. She broke down tasks into minute-by-minute shifts, portion checks at start of shift, vendor receiving checklists with signature blocks, a line audit form, a standard prep schedule that removed guesswork, and an emergency floater roster so a missing cook wouldn't tank an entire service. She ran simulations with a whiteboard and a stack of post-it notes, moving role names like pieces on a game board until every gap had a name and a deadline. Her approach was relentless in its smallness. We knew big wins arrive as a sum of small, repeated acts. Riley built the Rescue Summit as a stage designed to leave little room for spin. 2 camera angles, overlay graphics that would display consent letters live, and a tight agenda with time stamps down to the minute. Press would be invited, but the live feed would not be an open-ended town hall, it would be a forensic presentation. Marcus insisted on embedding legal notices into the agenda distribution so no one could claim they were surprised. Jenna insisted on a pre-meeting walkthrough with franchisees to answer practical concerns and to demonstrate that the summit was relief, not a spectacle. We created a script for each public speaker. Facts first, remedy second, timeline third. No invective, no pleading. I identified 3 flagships whose leases had step-in language that mattered. Noah read those clauses twice, underlining phrases about safety, hygiene, and managerial competence. Those clauses were intentionally dull, written decades ago to prevent physical damage, but they could be invoked when operations endangered a landlord's asset. We prepped notices, but we didn't send them until every other box was checked. Debt assignment done, landlord-council aligned, and a practical interim team ready to step in that morning. The choreography mattered. No landlord wanted a vacated building, and most preferred a working tenant to an empty unit collecting arrears. Franchisee consents were the last piece. Tom Barker convened owners on late calls, and Jenna walked through the 30-day stabilization plan until their questions stopped being hypothetical and started being logistical. The consents we gathered were conditional: sign here to authorize a management change if certain cure milestones weren't met. 10 franchisees signed quickly once we modeled food cost relief and training schedules. 2 more sat in the room waiting for the summit itself. The consensus felt fragile and solid at the same time. Fragile because family ties pulled both ways, solid because cash flow doesn't admire pedigree, it either balances or it doesn't. We set 3 rules and stuck to them: buy the debt with control rights, prearrange landlord support, and secure franchisee consents before any public move. No one tactic would win without the others. The playbook tightened around those constants until the plan felt less like a plan and more like a hinge waiting for a push. When Claire's committee approved the sale, the moment was quieter than I expected. We presented EBITDA deltas store by store, a spreadsheet of decline and potential, and a model that explained why 42 cents on the dollar was fair market for the bank's immediate risk. It was business math, merciless and clear. Funds wired in the early morning, the transfer landed like a key in a lock. Marcus had set up a bankruptcy remote special purpose vehicle with language that insulated the assets from countersuits and limited personal exposure. The SPV was a narrow corridor of certainty in a wide field of unknowns. At 10:07 a.m., an assignment of loans and security agreements landed in my inbox. I read the signature blocks with a strange calm. We filed UCC-3 amendments that afternoon and instructed our counsel to notify the borrower and the board of the loan assignment. The default clock began to tick the moment we validated covenant breaches on labor, turnover, and leverage ratios. It was a legal heartbeat: confirm the math, document the notices, and then wait for the statute to run. I remember sitting at my kitchen table with a mug of black coffee, no celebratory clink of glasses, just the feel of a signature under my thumb. Control slid into my hands with the same low hum as a door bolting. Marcus deployed preservation notices and a clean chain of custody for the files we'd received in the data room. We documented everything in triplicate because courts and creditors prefer facts that look like paper trails. There was a weird intimacy in reading the loan documents that used to bind my family. The covenants were stark and, in many places, ignored. That ignorance had become leverage. I felt a small, private satisfaction, nothing to the spectacle I imagined, just the knowledge that the machinery we built worked. Noah finalized step-in agreements on 3 flagship site leases with a degree of negotiation that felt like doing business with reluctant partners. Landlords wanted assurances. We'd pay to bring kitchens up to code, and we'd take on short-term liabilities tied to repairs. I negotiated timelines and penalty caps so their exposure would be limited once stability returned. We pre-drafted landlord notices and set courier routes, each envelope addressed and timed for service the morning of the summit if the default declaration held. The logistics read like military planning. Who serves what, when, and to whom? Franchisee consents came faster than I'd expected once Tom went to bat. He has a way of speaking that reduces theory to payroll. 10 of the 14 owners had signed conditional consent letters before we set the summit date. 2 more were committed to show up. Jenna led calls so franchisees could ask nitty-gritty questions about supply and training. Karen agreed to flip publicly at the summit after we arranged a retention package and indemnification for her role in supporting the transition. That was done on a whiteboard in Marcus's office, numbers lined up so Karen could protect herself and still tell the truth. Riley secured Ben Carter and 3 outlets that would amplify the live stream. We wanted witnesses who could quote numbers, not family lore. With loans assigned, landlord agreements in place, and franchisee consents lined up, the vote was more than a social ritual, it was a legal event with teeth. The timing had to be immovable. Once the notices were served and the step-ins initiated, the room would have to choose between governance and nostalgia. I called Dad once with an offer meant to keep things private and preserve what remained. I said we could quietly install an experienced interim if he agreed to remove Nate and step back. He listened for a long time and then hung up after saying, "You're not family when you talk like a lawyer." The word lawyer was a dismissal, and a dismissal is a kind of verdict he offered often. I had imagined he might shout. Instead, he clicked the call off with the same clipped finality he used to end board meetings. I withdrew the last of my private leverage because I calculated that half measures cost more than clean breaks. I stopped hoping for a family handshake and started buying instruments that would keep the kitchens open. A loyal franchisee accused me of staging a coup during a tense conference call, voice raised enough to fracture a speaker. I didn't argue, I explained it as rescue work, a management change needed to stabilize supply lines and preserve payroll. I framed the action in cash flow wins and staff retention, not as personal vengeance. Some called me cold for that. An investor I once liked called me cold in so many words. I decided warmth was a liability in negotiations where people could lose their homes or jobs. Mom texted a photo of a Sunday roast with "We miss you" under it. I looked at the photo of the browned roast and the empty chair and didn't reply. It hurt in an ordinary way, the kind of small pain that doesn't change a strategic decision. I wrote back to myself in a notebook instead, lists of names of people whose paychecks were at stake, dates for filings, and the sequence for the summit. Burning that bridge, I told myself, had to be deliberate. A retained bridge becomes a spur for hesitation. Hesitation costs payroll. There was clarity in the cut, no more private saves, no secret deals that kept the family myth intact at the cost of people's livelihoods. With the bridge burned, the logistics sharpened. Invitations went out on firm letterhead. Timelines were printed and stamped. The summit had a date, and the room would finally see the ledger I'd been balancing in the dark. I slept poorly, but with a clarity I'd never had in a family meeting. The choice would be public, the consequences visible, and the work irreversible once set in motion. We sent courier notice to Dad as borrower and to the board. The law required formal service, and service put stakes on a table. I wanted the message to be clear. Refusal to attend would be treated as a failure to cooperate, incurring their defaults. Marcus ran a script we rehearsed twice, opening with numbers, then remedies, then the vote. He told me not to say anything that sounded like revenge. "Stick to the ledger," he said. "Let the math do your work." That felt colder than I wanted sometimes, but the crispness saved lives and jobs. Riley booked a neutral room, ordered 2 lav mics, set a livestream landing page, and coordinated press badges. Ben Carter confirmed he'd come. Tom Barker and 8 franchisees confirmed their travel. Karen agreed to show she needed the retention package we'd sketched out, and we needed her voice to make the numbers undeniable. Noah and his counsel said they'd be ready to speak to step-in mechanics if we declared default. Jenna printed 3 binders for the room, audit, operational reset, and the forbearance form. I folded my lines into a small stack of index cards and rehearsed them until they sounded like breathing. The day we reopened the summit doors, I arrived early and stood by the lobby glass watching people flow in. Dad walked in with Nate 2 steps behind, scanning for a savior in a tailored suit. He looked for someone to hand the picture-perfect moment to, and he didn't expect to find me watching him like an audience. He stopped a few feet away from the receptionist and asked, loud enough to carry, "Do you work here?" The receptionist glanced up, and the question hung in the air with the hum of the building's ventilation. I answered, slow and even, no. I'm the owner. The words clipped the room like a bell. Riley's camera light went green and the livestream title appeared on phones. Rescue Summit Fisher Audit and Vote. Jenna stood at the check-in desk with name tags sorted: franchisees, vendors, media, her posture calm but alert. Marcus walked pockets deep with a folder of notices. Ben Carter, the business reporter, flipped open his notebook and looked up at me. There was no surprise in his eyes, only the curiosity of someone watching evidence form. The receptionist slid a consent to record form across the desk and Dad signed it with a scowl. Nate lingered at his shoulder like a press secretary left to act. I felt the old rush, every eye drawing me into a scene I'd been denied a decade to direct. But this time, the light was different. The room wasn't just waiting for a speech, it was waiting for an accounting. I opened the audit with data because data has less mercy and more credibility than rhetoric. The first slide was simple. Declining same-store sales percentages by quarter, annotated with labor variance spikes. I pointed to the line where ticket times climbed and comps rose. Jenna took the mic and walked through the kitchen failures in plain terms. Prep lists skipped, portion creep, and managers covering multiple stations without training. She showed a before and after of portion standards, photographs of inconsistent plating, and a log of missed receiving signatures that matched vendor complaints. Karen walked to the mic and did something I didn't expect. She owned the numbers out loud. Her voice was steady, not theatrical. She confirmed internal audit findings and corroborated the vendor emails that suggested improper payments. When she said the words, they sounded like a verdict from someone who'd been trapped by corporate comforts and finally found a hint of moral space to speak. Noah took the stand and read landlord complaints into the record. Grease buildup, safety citations on a rear exit, unreported roof leaks. He pointed to clauses in leases that required managerial oversight and immediate remediations. We didn't flinch from showing our forbearance template on screen. Marcus explained the cure path, specific milestones, who would run them, and timelines that made actual operational sense: 30, 60, and 90-day checklists, with performance markers that any manager could understand. I watched faces in the room shift as numbers replaced stories. Franchisees leaned in, vendors checked their phones, the livestream comments began to read as a running audience breath. When Marcus read the notice declaring technical default, the room changed shape. He spoke softly but deliberately: assignment of loans confirmed, covenants documented, defaults declared. A courier had 2 envelopes ready, one for the borrower's office, one for the board, and a server pushed the email to on-record addresses while staff served the hard copies in person. Noah's counsel stood by with step-in notices printed on legal paper. Jenna's team began distributing instruction packets to the managers at the 3 flagships we had on the list. Those packets contained immediate actions. Critical repairs to be addressed by noon, interim staffing rosters, and vendor contact lists with pre-approved ordering limits. We had prepped the managers so they wouldn't be blindsided. They got a toolkit instead of an edict. On the screen, franchisee consent letters flashed. 10 signatures were bold and clear. 2 more owners in the room nodded. I called the vote to remove Nate as CEO and to appoint an interim board for 90 days. It felt procedural and seismic at once. Hands rose: franchisees, some vendors, and, by creditor rights, me. The majority passed on stream. There was no roar, just the steady sound of hands settling into decisions that would alter paydays and lives. Marcus handed Dad a single-page term sheet. It was designed to be uncluttered: resign, issue a public retraction, accept a preserved pension and house, refuse, and we proceed to receivership with accelerated enforcement. Nate tried to bluster, but Marcus calmly reminded him of personal guarantees on 2 leases he'd signed without oversight. Dad read the paper with a hand that was older than the room. The microphone stood ready, the same long microphone that had once been used to dismiss me. He let the gravity of the moment settle, and then, in the same room he'd used to name me nothing, he chose to preserve a legacy in exchange for his privacy. He read the retraction aloud into the microphone. My daughter is the most capable leader this company has. The sentence landed and rearranged the air. I didn't smile. I checked the term sheet boxes, countersigned, and handed Jenna the operations binder. The room watched the reversal like a weather front shifting. Cameras caught the exchange, the live stream picked up the collective intake of breath. It wasn't catharsis so much as a transaction settled. The vote closed a chapter in a ledger and opened another in a calendar. We had executed a transfer of control with legal precision, operational immediacy, and public witness. The pride I might have expected was tempered by the sight of people's faces, relief, resentment, calculation, each as human and messy as I was. I felt something steadier than vindication. A responsibility that began the moment the signatures dried. Nate tried to speak first, bluster, a couple of rehearsed halting lines about legacy and loyalty. Marcus didn't let him finish. He leaned into the mic and calmly pointed out 2 personal guarantees Nate had signed on leases for out-of-state flagships, documents Nate had signed with a flourish during a ribbon cutting and apparently forgotten. The crowd exhaled a collective little gasp that had nothing to do with decorum and everything to do with realized risk. Dad sat very still, a small cut of light from the chandelier skimming his cheek like a scar. He read the term sheet as if it were a menu he'd been handed in a restaurant he no longer cared to own. When he spoke, the voice that came out was quieter than I expected, older, edged with the kind of fatigue people get after a long project of convincing everyone they're indispensable. He lifted the mic and said the words I'd demanded he say, a public retraction, frays to return dignity. My daughter is the most capable leader this company has, he said, and the sentence landed as if it had weight. It didn't erase the night at the banquet, and it didn't restore what had been taken from me in the dark years before, but it rearranged the room. I did not look for a burst of applause or some fairy tale thaw. Instead, I checked the boxes on the page, countersigned where Marcus had placed the line, and handed Jenna the operations binder. There was a long, practical silence. Cameras panned, the livestream comments scrolled, and the business reporter jotting notes looked at me with an unreadable expression. The public reversal was not a triumph of ego. It was a very efficient reallocation of authority. I felt its weight immediately, the responsibility to keep kitchens running, payroll protected, and the governance promises intact. The people in the room saw a transfer of power, some saw rescue, some saw an execution. I saw the start of winter work. The first pushes back were the kind that try to make you small by making noise. Dad threatened to sue for coercion in a voicemail I listened to in my car later that night. His voice shook the way people's do when they're terrified of losing control. Marcus moved fast. He filed a declaratory judgment action in state court the next morning and attached the live stream and the term sheet as exhibits. It was a defensive posture wrapped in one motion. You want a fight about coercion? Let's put the record where the public can see it. Marcus served their counsel with preservation notices and a demand to produce the email chains Nate had used to solicit guarantees. He was meticulous, the way surgeons are calm with scalpels. Nate tried to create a counter-narrative by texting franchisees and suggesting they withhold support. He framed it as a boycott. If they supported me, he warned, vendors might stop trusting them and investors might circle like vultures. I watched the thread for a long time and then sent a single reply all with Tom's price and training calendar attached. Tom, who knows how payroll reads on an Excel row more than he knows how to smile for fundraisers, replied all within minutes. If you want payroll, show up to training and keep the ovens hot. His bluntness shut down the flavored rhetoric fast. There were more subtle acts of sabotage. A mid-level manager in one location killed a Friday night promotional that would have brought in needed foot traffic, claiming supplies were missing. Jenna had anticipated that move and had a floater scheduled that night. We replaced him quietly before dinner with a trained leader from another unit, and the dining room filled in the second hour as if the night had been mapped that way from the start. Rumors spread that we'd slash staff and close units. Riley pushed out a video that explained stabilization plans, training, vendor consolidation, and payroll continuity without melodrama. He used smiling faces and numbers. How much we'd cut food costs, how many managers were getting promoted, and the fact that every employee would be paid on schedule that Friday. Vendors wavered, some called to say they wanted prepayment. I wired 5 critical prepayments to secure produce lines and grease strap service, and Marcus negotiated new terms where repayment would be subordinated to the forbearance schedule, protecting cash flow for immediate operations. We stopped rhetoric with cash where necessary. Ben Carter's headline the next morning summed it up cleanly: Creditors oust CEO at Rescue Summit, founder resigns, daughter installs interim board. The article was not wholly supportive, but it reported facts. Signatures, documents, and the timeline. Media can be a mirror or a magnifying glass. Here it was the latter, making everything larger and harder to deny. Installing control without dropping plates meant making the immediate practicalities of service and payroll inviolable. The interim board convened within 48 hours in a windowless conference room that smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. I chaired. Our priorities were threefold and unromantic: safety, staffing, and supply. Karen agreed to be interim chief financial officer under a retention agreement that protected her legacy and offered indemnification for speaking honestly. Her first act was cold and necessary. Cancel 2 marketing contracts that had been bleeding cash and reallocate money to vendor prepayments and repair budgets. We ran emergency training sessions on overnight shifts to avoid guest disruption. Jenna printed laminated prep lists and walked teams through portion standards and receiving checklists. She stood on a cracked tile floor of a flagship kitchen at dawn, the air heavy with steam and the smell of onions, and taught a line cook how to trim chicken properly to maintain plate weight. Those small, tactile acts showing a cook the exact depth of a portion scoop did more to earn trust than 1,000 memos. Noah did walkthroughs at the 3 flagged sites. He posted step-in signage by opening bell and walked managers through the immediate repairs that would need to be made. I visited a kitchen at 6 a.m. on a Thursday. The fluorescent lights made the stainless steel look clinical. I took off my blazer, tied back my hair, and helped hang a new inventory board. I handed a dishwasher a fresh pair of gloves and without ceremony told him his paycheck would be on time. He smiled in a way that wasn't theatrical. It was contractual and human. Payroll landed on time that Friday. The sound it made in employees' voices was small but solid. Trust sounds like a direct deposit hitting an account and a manager stopping by to say, "We're on this." The constraint that bit back showed up as a calendar date and a regulatory inspector's phone call. A pending health inspection window forced us to prioritize 2 locations for urgent fixes. We had funds allocated, but the timeline to get the exhaust cleaned, the backdoor hardware replaced, and a broken walk-in seal repaired was tight. Marcus reallocated legal reserves to cover temporary service contracts, and Noah negotiated a weekend schedule with vendors to accelerate work. Budgets tightened elsewhere. A franchisee demanded a sweetheart deal for having supported the vote, asking for a temporary margin concession in return for loyalty. I told him alignment could not be bought, we had to be fair to all owners. He grumbled, but we modeled his projected benefits and showed him a dashboard with the numbers. It wasn't emotional reassurance, but it worked. Claire's bank scheduled a 30-day checkpoint call and reminded us publicly that the credit policy required concrete milestones. That call became another clock we had to meet. Nate's lawyer served discovery demands that threatened to pull the team into litigation black holes. Marcus answered with a motion to dismiss certain claims and a preservation notice for their internal emails, buying us time and protecting the chain of custody for the documents we would need if they tried to reverse course. Staff asked if Dad would still drop by unannounced. I told them we had a calendar now, no more ambush management. That made some people laugh and others exhale. Even with those constraints, we progressed. The health inspection passed at one site after we rerouted a temp crew to clean and a vendor to recalibrate equipment. The bank's checkpoint call ended with Claire saying, "Show us progress and we'll keep the path open." That was all the validation we needed for the moment. A conditional nod from a lender who could, with a stroke, cut the oxygen. The margin for error remained thin, and every day felt like balancing a plate while running a sprint. But the plate stayed level because we prioritized small acts that mattered: paychecks, portion control, clear communication, and accepted that governance and optics would follow. Then there were the more insidious things: old family texts that Nate's camp leaked to a blogger that painted me as cold and overly legal. Someone in PR called it character assassination. I called it noise and let Riley decide whether to amplify it or ignore it. He chose to publish selective context, my resignation timestamp, the attendance list, and the audit highlights, and he paired it with an on-the-record quote. "Stability first, then improvement, hold us to the numbers." It's a sentence that reads like a spreadsheet and sounds a little clinical, but it gave people a place to grip beyond gossip. A local union organizer sniffed an opening and suggested we were union busting because we'd moved to stabilized positions and had asked staff to sign training waivers for rapid onboarding. Jenna invited staff reps to come into the audit room and walk the training and scheduling logs with her. She showed them the roster, the pay dates, and the exact portion controls we'd put in place. That transparency diffused a rumor faster than any press release. Claire Bennett from the bank had to answer questions from her internal compliance folks about selling the debt to someone with a family name. She answered plainly in a recorded call that had clipped statements about risk reduction and job preservation. That clip did more to quiet a committee meeting than any private conversation could. Ben Carter and a couple of freelance outlets ran stories that carried both sympathy for Dad's legacy and skepticism about governance under Nate. We asked to be judged by results, line checks, payrolls, repairs, and then published those exact metrics in a weekly report. It was boring, but boring papers make boring headlines, and boring headlines let people breathe. The community didn't all come around, and some people never would. A patron called our flagship to ask if the family fight was going to affect the sauce recipe. I told him the sauce comes from cooks who will be paid on time, and he laughed and said he'd book Saturday. Small wins like that built a different public. Operational gains came faster than I'd expected when we focused on the small things that touch customers directly. Ticket times shrank by about 3 minutes chain-wide in the first 2 weeks after the summit. It was a modest stat, but it changed the experience. Lunch hour flowed, phone lines cleared, servers stopped apologizing for delays. Comps dropped because managers stopped comping meals reflexively and instead followed the new recovery script Jenna had taught them. A vendor consolidation saved roughly 4% off our cost of goods sold, which we modeled to franchisees and passed along as immediate relief. It was math that made people feel safer and more willing to follow a plan. But progress never moves in a straight line. 2 franchisees missed onboarding sessions for the new supply protocols. I and Tom had a Sunday call to reset expectations and show them the cash flow projections. One key line cook walked out mid-shift on a Thursday, citing burnout. Jenna suited up and worked the line herself for an hour because the fastest way to rebuild trust is through visible competence. That act did more to calm staff than a memo. We also suffered a POS update failure in a single high-volume location that wiped a night of sales. Marcus extracted a make-good from the vendor that covered lost tips and downtime, but it was a reminder that the technology layer sitting on our operational fixes was brittle. We celebrated the small wins without fanfare because the runway was still short. Karen built a cash waterfall that prioritized debt service, pension obligations per the term sheet, and the immediate 30-day operating cash. We had to choose where to spend limited dollars: prepayments to vendors to secure produce lines, temporary contractors to repair exhaust systems, or marketing to bring customers back in. I chose supply and safety first. Customers can forgive a marketing gap if the food is hot and the dining room is clean. Noah negotiated rent abatements contingent on sales targets for 2 landlords, and he built those into a timeline that would reward both parties if we hit numbers. It was not glamorous, but it bought us time. Preparing the next move meant turning the short-term stabilization into a repeatable playbook and then scaling it into a pilot for the digital kitchens work I'd originally proposed. The interim board scheduled a permanent leadership vote in 30 days. I drafted a long-term plan, a pilot for 2 digital kitchens with centralized prep to lower labor needs, a staffed franchise support desk to prevent local inventory mistakes, a maintenance sweep to clear the backlog, and a simple loyalty app to encourage repeat visits. Karen ran scenarios and showed how a 15% improvement in gross margin chain-wide would fund tech pilots without new equity. We set 3 tactical priorities for the next 90 days. Lock vendor consolidation into binding contracts, pilot the digital kitchen in 2 units with a measurable reduction in labor cost, and finish the maintenance list in the flagged sites. For each priority we assigned ownership, a single person accountable with a dashboard. Jenna owned the pilot, Karen owned the cash model and retention incentives, and Noah owned lease negotiations. We also prepared communication playbooks. A staff town hall to go through the pilot schedule, a franchisee webinar to show the math, and a press Q&A planned for after the board vote. Riley rehearsed answers to likely questions and prepped a short video we'd release showing before and after metrics so the public could see the chain's progress. The ambush attempt arrived on vote day like a cold email with a heavy signature. Nate's lawyer stood up and waved a trademark ownership dispute letter he'd filed the previous week. He suggested we were stepping on intellectual property and claimed a hurried filing for the brand name had precedence. For half a breath the room leaned forward the way audiences do when a surprise plot twist threatens to redraw the map. I let him finish because that was exactly the performance he wanted. Then I did something deliberate. I pulled up the United States Patent and Trademark Office record I'd quietly secured months earlier through a subsidiary, an administrative filing for the core mark and the sauce label, registered and stamped with dates that predated Nate's hurried paperwork. Marcus explained the filing in plain terms. Our filing predated theirs, our entity held the continuity rights, and their filing was an opportunistic cover. He walked the room through chain of title evidence, the assignment papers, and the corporate structure that made the legal claim clear. It was an unsentimental, papered-over moment that removed drama in favor of documentation. Dad tried to lean the room with a speech about family and legacy. He read from memory the origin story about how he'd opened the first location and fed a town a recipe that became local. I listened and nodded. Legacy is persuasive because it's simple, but governance is about operations and obligations. I told him gently that this wasn't about erasing the past, but about making sure his work didn't disappear into a cascade of defaults. That felt like a small mercy. A franchisee hesitated at the vote, uneasy about litigation risk. Tom asked the one practical question that cuts through story: who made payroll the last 2 Fridays? The franchisee's answer was a practical one. He looked at his own books and admitted it was me and the new plan that kept ovens running. That nudged him. When the vote moved forward, Marcus filed the trademark documentation into the record as part of the board package, closing the theatrical attempt to ambush us with paperwork. The attempt to reverse the political momentum failed because we'd done the quieter, harder work, the filings, the checks, the steps no one applauds. The room saw the lever pulled and the counter lever already in place. I accepted the vote with conditions I'd written down the night before: transparency dashboards for franchisees, a standing staff council with rotating seats, and a 30-day operational checkpoint with Claire's Bank to make sure obligations stayed met. Those conditions weren't soft, they were governance tools meant to prevent a repeat of the old fog. I knew trust could not be conjured, it had to be produced as a series of predictable actions. When asked if I would lead permanently, I said yes, with the caveat that leadership would be measured by deliverables, not by photo ops. That clarity mattered. Dad asked if the apology had to remain public record. He sounded smaller than he had at the banquet, the way people sound when the work of reputation begins to cost something real. I said yes. Integrity requires a ledger. If your words shape a public record, a retraction had to be equally public. He read the scripted lines into the mic, and the words sat in the room like furniture that had been moved to different walls. The vote closed a door that could not be opened the same way again. When Marcus filed the board minutes that afternoon and forwarded copies to Claire and Noah, it felt anticlimactic and monumental at the same time, like a final signature on a contract that would dictate the next season of people's lives. The new equilibrium was not dramatic. It was a series of small, visible acts that made life safer and duller in the best way: steady paychecks, cleaner kitchens, predictable schedules, ticket times held, comps dropped. Staff turnover, which had been a bleeding wound, stabilized. I started with the priorities we'd set: safety, staffing, supply. Karen renegotiated 2 supplier contracts to include audit rights. She cut out the middlemen who'd been skimming margins and put in place real inventory checks. That saved real dollars and, more importantly, removed the shadow deals that had hollowed out quality. Mom and I met at a small suburban bakery on a Tuesday morning. She arrived with the same careful smile she's perfected for donors and polite society, but there was a tremor under it now that hadn't existed before. She said she was proud, and I said we keep the books honest now and that we'd protect jobs first. We didn't discuss the banquet. It was a kind of truce by omission. Dad kept his house and his pension per the term sheet. That was conscious. I wanted people to feel the consequences but not to be left without shelter. The term sheet protected employees first. His comforts were part of the negotiated reality because preserving families matters in the ledger too. Jenna hired 3 assistant managers from within the chain, promotions that were announced quietly in the back rooms before we told press. Those promotions were small public acts that mattered to the people who work with you at 5 a.m. Karen started monthly operational audits and published a short summary for franchisees, 3 metrics we'd track publicly, updated weekly. Noah negotiated rent abatements tied to sales targets. The landlords got clarity and we got runway. The cost of this new balance was personal. Sunday dinners were different. Mom called less often or more cautiously. I didn't go home the way I used to. But lights stayed on and wages were paid, and that steadiness was worth the smaller, private losses. There was a visible change in the flagship where we'd nearly lost the lease. The kitchen ran tighter, the sightlines in the dining room were cleaner. Servers moved with a rhythm that suggested confidence. I stood there one night watching a server deliver a dessert I had skipped the night I left, the same dessert I'd wanted that banquet evening when they cut me off. The plate looked simple vanilla, a drizzle of caramel, but it tasted like work returned to order. Ben Carter asked for a quote and I gave him one that had no swagger and no vindictiveness. "Measure me by what we build, not what we burn." He filed it under a story that had room for nuance. We hung a new board in the employee hallway next to the framed photo of Dad, the original founder. Instead of only showing the triumphant ribbon-cutting images, we added a running list of franchisee milestones and staff of the month names. The wall became both a record and a promise. People and places mattered. Riley lowered the camera after the press Q&A and we let the room be a restaurant again. Not every win deserved a live stream. Some wins are measured by the sound of a kitchen doing its work without a drama. At the mic in a calm dining room a few weeks later, I looked out at a crowd that included franchisees, managers, and a few familiar faces from the bank. The lights were softer than the banquet. I kept it deliberately short. "You were wrong about me," I said, and the room inhaled like a collective recognition. But I was right about this. It wasn't a flourish, it was a fact we'd proven: governance and care could coexist. The room didn't erupt in applause. Instead, it went back to work. That return to regularity felt like the sound of a contract being honored. If you were ever dismissed by family or bosses and took your power back, share your story in the comments. Subscribe, hit the bell, and tell a friend. These stories keep coming because people need witnesses.